Here's what you need to know about The Last of Us before watching Season 2. I'll be doing a quick recap on Season 1, so spoiler alert for that, as well as the first Last of Us video game. Joel is a single dad looking after his daughter, Sarah, with some help from his brother Tommy. Unfortunately, a new kind of fungal infection sparks a global societal collapse, and in the chaos, Sarah tragically dies. 20 years later, Joel is now living in Boston. Society is still largely collapsed, but some cities have become quarantine zones governed by FEDRA, the Federal Disaster Response Agency, which at this point is essentially the only government still standing and has strict regulations for the people living in the quarantine zone. We also hear a little bit about a rebellion group known as the Fireflies, who are opposed to FEDRA's rule, but more on them later. Joel's ultimate goal right now is to find his brother Tommy, who went missing on his way out west to Wyoming. Joel and his current partner Tess have been smuggling goods to FEDRA guards in exchange for leads on a working vehicle. But a new opportunity presents itself when they run into Marlene, the leader of the Fireflies, who offers them a deal. She'll give them a working truck that they can take to Wyoming, and all they have to do is safely escort this teenage girl to the Massachusetts State House and hand her over to another group of Fireflies. Joel and Tess are suspicious of the Fireflies' motives, but with no other options, they accept. Ellie turns out to be an incredibly feisty, rebellious, and foul-mouthed kid, but it's not entirely clear why she's so special until they're caught by a guard and Ellie tests positive for infection. The three are able to escape, and Ellie claims she is immune to the infection. Again, Joel and Tess are suspicious, but they have to get Ellie to the Fireflies alive to get their truck, so they continue onward and unfortunately run into the infected. As I mentioned before, in the world of The Last of Us, the infection is caused by a fungus known as cordyceps. Cordyceps is a real-life fungus, but it currently only affects insects and a few other species. However, what it does is pretty terrifying. The fungus releases spores that will penetrate an ant's exoskeleton and alter its behavior. The ant is compelled to leave its nest and go to a climate that better suits the fungus's growth. Once there, the fungus will devour the still living ant as it grows and eventually releases more spores. In The Last of Us, cordyceps have mutated to the point of affecting humans, and there's progressive stages of infection. At first, it's kind of like your typical zombie, but over time, it just gets worse and worse. For instance, one of the later stages is called a clicker. And it's called a clicker because by this point, their head has essentially turned into a fungus itself, and they can't see anymore, so they primarily function through sound, using a kind of crude echolocation technique to hunt you, which is why they're always making this clicking noise.
Ew.
Now in the video game, in addition to direct contact from an infected person, the fungi also travels through airborne spores. However, in the show, the infected operate a little differently even though they look pretty similar. Instead of spores, the infected in the show have these tendrils. The tendrils are in each of the infected but can also form vast networks, making them kind of like a hive mind. While encountering the infected, Ellie is bit, but again, she shows no sign of the infection progressing, proving she is actually immune. Sadly, Tess was also bit and is not immune. This devastates Joel, but Tess is finally hopeful again because she realizes why Ellie is so important. Tess and Joel have just been surviving. They've become ruthless people, they've kind of lost their humanity, but Ellie now represents the slightest glimmer of hope with her immunity. If the Fireflies can figure out a way to recreate that immunity, maybe things can go back to the way they were. Knowing she's doomed anyway, Tess sacrifices herself to allow Joel and Ellie to escape. Unfortunately, all the Fireflies that were meant to take Ellie were taken out by the same infected they just encountered, but Ellie knows they were planning to take her out west, so that's where they head. Now I'm going to give some pretty broad strokes for some of the intervening episodes so we can keep a grasp of the central plot points. For instance, Bill and Frank's story occupied a whole episode and was incredibly well told and very much gives some life and depth to this world, but it doesn't have a massive impact on what happens to Joel and Ellie, so we're pressing forward. Basically, Joel and Ellie continue trekking across the US, but there's dangers that sidetrack them along the way. What you really need to know is that Ellie goes through several traumatic events that really force her to confront the reality of the outside world. She spent most of her life living in the quarantine zone, which is no cakewalk, but the brutality of the outside world is shocking even to her. Joel is more used to it, but he kind of has to experience the trauma again because he's witnessing it alongside Ellie. For instance, Ellie gets blood on her hands for the first time when Joel's life is in danger and she has to help him take the life of another human being. As Joel and Ellie continue traveling, they build a mutual respect and even admiration for one another. Joel is reluctant to acknowledge how much he cares for Ellie because he doesn't want to have to experience the pain of losing a daughter all over again, so he remains emotionally unavailable. We also learned that the reason Ellie discovered she was immune was another tragic experience. While exploring an abandoned mall, her and her friend Riley, with whom she had a budding romance, encounter infected and are both bitten. They decide to enjoy their last moments together, but we of course know that while we don't see it, Ellie would have had to have watched Riley's infection slowly take over while she herself was immune. Obviously at this point we should be catching on to the fact that the world our characters inhabit in this story is a miserable one. It's filled with death and despair, but I would argue that there's a purpose to all this. It's not sad and bleak just to be edgy. It's putting our characters in the worst spot possible so that their battle to choose hope feels like a genuine struggle. When a story revolves around the idea of choosing hope in the face of despair, it can sometimes feel a little obvious to the audience. It may still be pleasant, but we were never in doubt about the characters' ability to overcome their challenges and sorrows. But when we're placed in a world like The Last of Us, that conflict and the tension of whether or not our characters will be able to make any sort of moral choices that value life and optimism is really in question. You're not sure if they'll be able to. Once they reach Wyoming, Joel is reunited with his brother Tommy, who is living in a thriving community. It actually seems livable and something at least sort of reminiscent of how things used to be. be. And it's here that we're presented with the new perspectives that Joel and Ellie have formed over the course of their journey. Ellie was initially resistant to anyone telling her what to do, but having seen the horrors of the real world, and knowing that her immunity could potentially mean something important to humanity, she wants to continue on and find the Fireflies. Joel, however, is really struggling at the thought of losing Ellie, and thus does not want to accompany her further. Ellie misinterprets this as Joel not caring, which is devastating because Joel has become the one person that she can trust. But Tommy knows what's really going on because he knows about Sarah, Joel's daughter, and he's eventually able to convince Joel to go with Ellie. On the way, we have a few more traumatic experiences, but with the worst seemingly behind them, Joel and Ellie reach the Fireflies base in a hospital in Utah. It's only after Ellie is already under anesthesia that Joel is told the procedure of turning Ellie's immunity into a potential cure will also result in her death. Joel is faced yet again with the threat of tragic loss, only this time, the stakes are not so simple. Joel has spilt plenty of blood protecting Ellie thus far, but the circumstances now are entirely different. Ellie's sacrifice could mean that hope for all of humanity is restored, but at the expense of Joel's own personal hope. He lost a daughter once, and the universe delivered him a second one, and now he's being asked to lose her too. So we go back to that question about whether our characters will choose hope, and we're confronted with this dilemma where that choice isn't even quite as clear as we might expect, especially for Joel. Is it more hopeful to choose a path of redemption for everyone, or to restore hope in himself by preserving Ellie's life at the expense of others? For us as the audience, the choice may feel simple. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. But here's where I will say that I think there's a stark difference between the experience of playing the game and watching the TV show. The route in which you get to this point in the story is a little different, but this final conflict is essentially the same in both the game and the show. In the game, you've spent dozens of hours playing as Joel. You're literally walking around in his shoes, fought off numerous people and infected, and all the while gotten to know and love Ellie. So when you get to this point, you're really in his headspace. It's a lot easier to think, no way am I letting them take Ellie. And we spent enough time with Joel in the show to get a glimpse of that, but I don't know if it's quite as visceral. All that said, when Joel makes the decision that he's not willing to lose Ellie, the fallout is shocking in both the game and the show. Joel proceeds to be a one-man army and takes out all the Fireflies throughout the hospital to save Ellie. When Ellie wakes up, Joel tells her a lie, that the Fireflies determined a cure could not be made from her immunity, so he took her away. You'd think Ellie might be glad to be alive, but she's actually devastated. She was hopeful for humanity, and she was going to be able to directly contribute in a meaningful way to restoring that hope for everyone, and then she learns it was all for nothing. So if Joel taking out all the Fireflies in the hospital wasn't enough, we now see another dynamic in which his choice may have been more selfish than we realized. He's chosen his own hope and comfort over Ellie's own hope and her desire to help all of humanity. The game and the show end in a similar scene. Ellie senses that Joel may not be telling the truth and asks him to swear on it. She gives him one final opportunity to tell her what really happened, and he lies to her again. It's an absolutely heartbreaking scene because we know that Joel is a broken man and he's just clinging to the last bit of life that he has. And it's not clear whether Ellie really believes him or not, but she decides to trust him again because, like I mentioned before, he's really the only person she can trust. He's the only person in her life that hasn't left her. So these two characters end this part of the story at a kind of impasse, where Joel is trying to keep his hope and his relationship with Ellie alive, but by doing so is breaking the very foundation of their relationship in the process. So that's where we head into Season 2, but I have just a little bit more info for you having played the video game, The Last of Us Part 2. Don't worry, I'm not going to spoil Season 2 or the video game, but I did want to address some things. The story of the second game, which Season 2 of the show will be partially adapting, was divisive for fans of the first game. I would love to talk more about that, but I don't want to do it here so as to not spoil the show. And please, for anyone that has played the game, don't spoil it in the comments. All I'll say is that if you've just watched the TV show, but you've heard about the second game's divisive reception, I would recommend not letting that taint your experience watching the second season. Because one, they might change the story, so you never know what will happen, but two, I think the story in the second game was phenomenal. I'm not trying to trash anyone's genuine reactions or act like I'm smarter than anyone, but I do think a lot of the negative reactions are a result of misunderstanding the thematic goals of the whole story of The Last of Us. And I'll probably do a video explaining why once the show has come out so we can talk about that later. But in the meantime, I hope this was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions, and let me know if you're excited for Season 2.